So before I begin, I made a selection of photos for you guys in the background, just so you would have something to look at. But also, I mean, these are all photos of Beirut that myself and a couple of other photographers. I'm not a photographer, but some of them are my personal photos and some of them are from photographers of Beirut over the last 4 years, but mostly over the last 2 years, which I'm kind of going to be talking about in my talk. So anyway, all right. When I'm asked to define the relationship between my two main languages, as someone who lives in an Arabic-speaking country but writes in English, I like to say that I'm someone who thinks in English but feels in Arabic. And this is largely true, though of course, just as there's no clear separation between thinking and feeling, these languages flow into and interact with one another in all kinds of ways. In fact, the environment and language I always feel most comfortable, most myself in, is a bilingual one. But in my writing, there's a whole side of myself, let alone the living, breathing, changing world around me, the world I'm most engaged in, that has to be either left out or translated. Because the simple fact is that I write in English. And when people ask me why that is, I like to say that the amputation of my mother tongue is a war wound. Partly because it sounds nice. Also, it sums up the fact that I lost my written fluency in Arabic when my family immigrated from Lebanon to Canada at the end of the Civil War. But that erosion of Arabic began before and actually belongs to a war much older and less visible than that. It comes from an entire way of seeing one's place in the world, one that was in many ways created and enforced by Western colonialism, and then after that by the neo-colonialism of the English language, which presents itself to every non-native speaker with an unspoken assurance of its own cultural supremacy. So as a child growing up in Beirut, I was placed in English school, gifted with English books, praised for my aptitude in English. I understood from all of this that English was somehow superior to Arabic, or would get me farther in life than Arabic. But of course, I apply this analysis now, in retrospect. At the time, discovering English, discovering reading and writing, there was only my delight in expression, and it happened that I did this most proficiently in English. I devoured all the books I was given, and very early on, I knew that I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a writer out of a kind of greed. There was a communion that existed on the page, a sense of all reality cracking open and making any distance between myself and the story, cultural, historical, temporal, completely non-existent. It felt like what I would now describe as love or religious ecstasy, the I subsuming itself in something larger, a temporary eradication of all loneliness or sense of alienation. And for a lonely child growing up during a war and seeking any kind of respite from it, that feeling of oneness was one of the truest respites I had from an overwhelming feeling of sorrow, but also the place where I could inhabit my sorrow most cleanly, if that makes sense. A place where my sorrow wasn't something that alienated me from other people, but proved that I was part of a common human family of feeling. And this made me feel less alone, less afraid, even in the middle of war. Eventually, I came to realize that all of this had a creator behind it, that this communion had been authored, crafted by a person out there, and that everyone reading a particular story had probably felt the same kind of oneness with the writer, regardless of their circumstance. This is why I say that greed was my first motivator. I wondered whether in crafting a gift, one could in fact get to keep more of it for oneself. Back then, I don't think I was really aware of my reading as taking place in a specific language, because ironically, it helped transport me outside of language. It seems to me that the most beautiful or well-wrought sentences, the ones whose craft you most admire, are also the ones most capable of carrying you outside the constraints of language, recreating an entire range of feeling larger than the sum of its words, and allowing you to inhabit it fully, almost physically. And so from the outset, it's always felt to me that the things most worth writing about somehow lie outside the borders of language. In fact, at one point, every complex idea lay outside the borders of language until a writer gave it a name and brought it into the common lexicon. That, to me, is the primary and most fundamental act of translation that writing performs, to bring the amorphous and sensory into the concrete signifiers of words, so that the reader is then allowed passage back into the realm of pure feeling. And so as a child, there was no contradiction between the two languages I lived in. Maybe I didn't even notice that I lived in two separate languages, because there were enough bilingual people around me that this mix was its own language. It was only when we moved to Canada that I became aware of my difference. That's when I began to feel an intense estrangement between where I had come from and this new place. And this estrangement was one very much contained in language. If you'll permit me, I'm going to read you an excerpt from an essay I wrote called War in Translation, which was inspired by the work I did, and still do, translating the accounts of Syrians who've lived through war. Quote, "When my family and I washed up in Canada, carried out on the great wave of migration away from the civil war in Beirut, I found that I could no longer unlock the trunk in which I carried the words to explain where I had come from and what I had lived. When I did manage to force it open, what I found inside was soggy, useless. The words were all in another language, non-native to this new soil. I translated them as best as I could. Qazife became shell. Msallahin became militiamen, gunmen. Hajiz became checkpoint. Malja became shelter. But the new words were strangely light. They carried none of the weight of what they truly meant. Qazife was piercing and hot, abject terror, near misses, and direct hits. It was luck and unluck. It was what left the neighbor boy with melted clumps for hands and took away my grandmother's hearing in one ear, and what missed my father again and again as he crossed the border to Syria and back over 4 long years on his way to the Canadian consulate, checking on the status of our visas. Msallahin were those who held your life in their hands every time you passed through a hajiz made of sandbags, militia flags and insignia fluttering above, the colors and shapes meaning the difference between friendly and unfriendly, sometimes life and death. Msallahin scrutinized your papers and peered into your car with slitted predatory eyes as you made yourself as small as possible. They were those who kept your neighborhood safe, those who made your neighborhood a target. Malja was long, sleepless nights, the whole building crowded into one airless underground room, the dizzying smells of mold and other people's bodies, listening to qazife after qazife fall all around you, the echoes booming in your chest, as intimate and sure as heartbeat. But Malja was also endless games of cards and forced sleepovers with friends caught at your place overnight, watching the way the old neighbor twitched as he snored and plotting to steal his dentures as he slept, your giggles luckily muffled by the sound of gunfire. Gunfire, now the catch-all name for M16, Kalashnikov, 120, B7, Grad, Doshka, Katyusha, Hauen, my skills in telling weapons grades apart by sound now rendered useless. But once I had the words translated, I found that no one really wanted to hear them, be near them. They were light in English, yes, but also cumbersome and huge, giant styrofoam shapes. When I carried them with me into the classroom or into the home of new friends, I had to struggle to fit them through the door. Their size dwarfed me, crowded me out. Everyone stared. When I tried to put them down, they formed a barrier, setting me apart as so inconceivably other, it became impossible to clamber over them, to find my way back to the world of school dances and mall outings, pop quizzes, and notes passed back and forth about your crush this week. In order to enter, then, to become one amongst the many individuals that made up my new world, I had to let go of that whole lexicon, to repudiate it, as if it were a sort of shame. For years, I wrote stories about Jennies and Kevins and Melissas, about their suburban childhoods and private disappointments, about dreams and desires moved only by the eddies of a personal history, floating far above the undertow and tidal shifts of collective history, trying to rewrite my past in an effort not to have to translate it. I had become used to feeling light. I did not want my country, its history, hanging around my neck like a weight I must always carry, unable to take it off or put it down. I did not want to be buffeted about in the whirlpool resultant from the violent meeting of two currents, the personal and the historical, perpetually sucked down into the eye of the vortex, along with the thousands upon thousands of other bodies carried there by the same riptide. And everyone around me drowning. How could I live with attempting to save myself alone? Unquote. Translation obviously requires a proficiency in at least two languages. Proficiency enough to understand, first, all the fundamentals and nuances of the language from which you're translating, but also the subtleties and implications and imagery and idiom of the language into which you're translating. You're not just trying to transpose words from one language to another, which is why, fingers crossed, Google Translate is still miles behind us when it comes to literary translation. You're trying to transplant a feeling, a way of seeing the world from one vocabulary of experience to another. And that's how I think of my writing as well, since I finally gave myself permission to write about what interests me most rather than thinking about what an audience might most like to hear. But that doesn't mean I don't think about my audience. In fact, that's one of the main balancing acts of my writing, one that is particularly familiar to any translator, in fact. Because as a translator, you're always trying to be cognizant of what your audience might or might not be familiar with. And you're always translating with the awareness that you're trying to make the translated text as legible in its new language as it is in its original one. At the same time, I never want to cast myself as a mere cultural interpreter, because it's ultimately to the detriment of my writing, let alone my personhood. And so the trick is the same one that has to be performed in any self-conscious act. Because writing itself is ultimately a self-conscious act. That is, it is the act of a self conscious of wishing to be heard. At the same time, however, if that quality of self-consciousness is too present, it alienates the audience from the work in ways that aren't always so productive. And so the paradox is that you have to become unaware of the audience because you're aware of the audience. These remained largely abstract concerns for me until the last couple of years made them imperative questions that I had no choice but to actively think about and address. In the 2+ years since October 2019, Lebanon has lived, and as a result I have lived, enough tumult and crises to fill an entire lifetime. First, there was an uprising against the ruling class that had us in the streets protesting day and night for 3, 4, 5 months until the first coronavirus lockdown arrived and put an end to street protests once and for all. At the same time, our economy was first in crisis and is now in full-blown collapse. It is, quote, one of the 3 worst global crises since the mid-19th century, unquote, according to the World Bank. Now, because I'm fluent in 2 cultures, I know that when most people hear these words in English, economic crisis or economic collapse, they don't know what they entail exactly, except some form of extreme misery, poverty, unemployment, things that exist in all cities, in all places, but which are more often than not invisible. As in, they are not things that intrude insistently upon your daily life, making it almost impossible to think about anything else. Because in such protracted crises, there's a kind of anxiety that pervades your every waking moment and even finds its way into your dreams. A dangerous hum, the kind made by electrical lines, playing constantly beneath every conversation or interaction or joyful experience you might be having. And I think it is this persistence and the ways it manifests which is most difficult to imagine for those who aren't in that position. That's really the biggest kind of space that exists between all of us, so big that it is the one inside which all the others can fit. Ethnicity, class, nationality, mental health history, physical appearance, ability, gender, sexual orientation, family history, etc., etc. It is the space that art, that writing, that translation is ultimately engaged in bridging, which is the difficulty in imagining what it is to inhabit someone else's reality in the fullest way possible. And so let me try to give you a taste of what it is to be living an economic collapse, to translate the experience for you. Because it's in fact one of the threats that stalks all of us who are living under extractive capitalism, a system whose balance has always relied on building and maintaining wealth for the few at the expense of exhausting and exploiting the many. And you don't realize how precarious that balance really is, or rather that massive imbalance, until it irrevocably tips. I won't get into the details because they are many, and because I'm not an economic expert, though I've had to learn a lot about how the economy functions by virtue of being caught in its collapse. But essentially, this was a crisis engineered by a collusion between the government and the banking system, with each now currently maintaining their innocence and blaming the other for the disaster. What we do know for a fact is that many people knew this crisis was coming because the government was indebted to the banks to such an extent, and the banks were continuing to knowingly lend money to a bankrupt government while promising their depositors exceedingly high interest rates, that it was a balance that couldn't be maintained. To pay off the debt, the banks seized the savings of all small depositors while allowing the big depositors, most of whom are members of the government and their cronies, to transfer their money out of the country by the hundreds of millions. On top of losing all our savings, our local currency, artificially pegged to the dollar at a steady rate for decades now, has lost 96% of its value. And the minimum wage, which was once equivalent to $450 a month, is now worth less than $30. For a country that imports about 80% of what it consumes, it means that very basic goods are now unaffordable, that labs and hospitals are shutting down because they can't afford the materials, medication, and equipment they require, and that the government can no longer provide basic services like electricity. Nearly 80% of the population has been plunged into poverty, with over 50% living in extreme poverty. I know, this part with all the statistics is quite abstract, and maybe you've drifted off a little. I know that when I read newspaper articles listing these facts one after the other, my own eyes glaze over. So let me translate that into human terms. Say one day you wake up with a headache, a blinding headache, because you haven't been sleeping well lately, because you stay up all night wondering how you're going to pay your children's school tuition, because you've deferred payment 3 times already, and the administration is threatening to kick them out. You've appealed to the administration countless times. Please, you've said, I can pay eventually, but the banks only allow me to withdraw so much every month. Please, we're all in this together. And anyway, the school year has been hardly existent, given that the kids have had to do all their schooling from home. And I had to save the money from the last 4 withdrawals to buy a new laptop, because before that, the kids had to share my wife's laptop, and she needs it for work. But the administration doesn't budge. Sorry, they say, everyone is suffering, and we can't make exceptions for anyone. So that morning you go to your local pharmacy to get some Panadol, but they don't have any. The shelves are mostly empty of medicine. The pharma companies are refusing to give us more stock, says the pharmacist. They're waiting for the subsidies to be lifted so they can charge more money. You know this pharmacist well. She's been so helpful with advice before when one of the kids was running a fever and you couldn't afford to go to the doctor. Still, you have to bite your lip to stop yourself from unleashing your frustration at her. You go on to the next pharmacy, which also has no Panadol, and then the next. Your head is pounding harder now, and you can hardly see. The concrete traps heat, and the streets are noisy, and the sound of generators is everywhere, and the fumes are dizzying and make it hard to breathe. Still, you're glad you're on foot. The traffic is so bad that the streets are nearly indistinguishable from parking lots. This is because most of the cars on the street are parked in a queue, waiting their turn to fill up at the gas station. Queues are now 3 hours long on average because the supply is nearly non-existent, because the gas cartels are also waiting for the subsidies to be lifted so they can charge more money. Fights often break out at the gas stations now, pushing and shoving, yelling and kicking. Sometimes people pull out knives, sometimes guns. Some of the gas station employees have taken to arming themselves with sticks and batons. Everyone is at breaking point and has very little patience anymore. As you enter the next pharmacy, which is crowded with people, even though the sign outside says no more than 2 at a time, you have to remind yourself to pull your surgical mask over your nose. You're not afraid of catching COVID. That seems like the least of your worries given everything that's going on. But you have to remind yourself that if one of you should require hospitalization, it would bankrupt you entirely. Not to mention that even despite all that, you might still die because there are no more ventilators and no more medicine available, like what happened to your local baker who passed away because he could no longer afford his asthma medication. You're not afraid of dying, but of the humiliation of it, or rather the humiliation that will be visited upon your family because your wife's income alone is barely enough to cover the generator fees, let alone funeral costs. At the last pharmacy you visit, there is a sign that says, quote, "You are not allowed to talk about the situation or to exclaim any surprise or anger at what we don't have. We are all suffering, you no more than others," unquote. You don't even bother asking for Panadol at this pharmacy because you know that if they say no, you might be liable to start smashing things up out of rage. You yourself have now reached the end of your patience. As you walk back home, you're stopped on the street by a young woman, slightly younger than you are. She has a baby in her arms. Both of their faces are streaked with dirt. "Please," she says, "I have children to feed. I can't afford milk for my baby." For a minute, you think about giving her the money you brought to buy the Panadol, but as you hesitate, she tugs at your sleeve, and at her insistence, whatever sympathy you had turns to rage. All the rage you have been suppressing all morning at the unfairness of everything now finds its target in the shape of this woman whose pleading voice fills your already aching head with a leaden weight, with a burden of guilt you refuse to carry. "I have it as bad as you snap. We're all suffering." And you pull your arm away roughly and walk off, seething with an unnameably ugly feeling. You're almost home now, your head so painful that you have to squint your eyes nearly shut against the sunlight. It's actually a beautiful spring day. The bougainvillea is blazing brightly against this clear sky, but there's nothing beautiful in the day for you. As you walk into the merciful shade of the building entrance, you run into your neighbor. He asks you rotely, "Everything all right?" And though everyone is programmed to answer, "We're still surviving," rather than plunge into any of the countless miseries that everyone is trying to contend with, you actually tell him, "No, I have a terrible headache and I can't find Panadol anywhere." And you're surprised when he answers, "I have Panadol at home. Let me give you some." The kindness of the 2 pills he places without question into your palm are enough to make you weep, but the sharp, terrible memory of having refused a similar kindness only minutes before to someone else constricts your throat and dries your tears. You vow that next time, whatever it is in your power to make someone else's day a little easier, you will do it, if you can. Because this is the truth about living in crisis, the thing that doesn't come across in the headlines, that can only be really conveyed through art, through writing. Crisis does several things at once. It can widen the space between us. It can isolate people inside their own suffering and strip them of empathy because they have so little energy to extend beyond that required for very basic functioning. But it can also draw people together in countless ways, and it can turn simple kindness into an act of resistance. The most important thing that writing does, I think, is preserve the smallness, the ambiguity, and the particularities of the human experience as it unfolds against the backdrop of crisis with a capital C. It reminds us that life always unfolds in ordinary time. As such, it can confound the usual narratives of suffering, which, when presented as a flat, endless plane, give you no texture on which to snag your imagination. Nothing that presents the same complex, confusing, and specific sort of emotional landscape, that exists inside you. But crisis can also make you question the entire point of writing or creating. And I found myself struggling with both with and against this during the last 2 years. I'm struggling with the point of it all, even though this has in many ways been the central question at the heart of everything I do: how to write about crisis. Because the history my country has left me to contend with is one of crisis followed by crisis. But writing about this from a relative point of safety, like when I would write about the war from a safe inside the post-war, is one thing. And writing about crisis from ground zero, from inside the unfolding cataclysm, while you're trying to adapt to it, is something else entirely. I come back again and again to the Palestinian writer Mahmoud Darwish's book, Memory for Forgetfulness, written about and from within the Israeli invasion and bombardment of Beirut in 1982. I look to it as a handbook on writing about war and crisis in many ways. In the book, Darwish expresses repeatedly the desire for, quote, a language that I can depend on and that can depend on me, that asks me to bear witness and that I can ask to bear witness, unquote. And yet he also acknowledges the absurdity of writing when war brings, quote, human relations, space, time, and the elements back to a state of nature, making us rejoice over water gushing on the road from a broken pipe, unquote. It's important for me to remember that, actually, because I feel that too often writers like to delude themselves about the nobility of their calling. What I love most about these two quotes of Darwish here is that they acknowledge the entire spectrum of what writing is. It reinforces the responsibility that writers have toward language itself. It affirms that writing helps offer both the writer and the reader comfort, but also acknowledges that this is an existential sustenance that can never make up for material, physical sustenance. And so it has helped me to think of writing in crisis as that thing that one does in order to be useful, to keep busy. Things are collapsing, we need all hands on deck, and everyone needs to pitch in with the thing they know how to do best. But the practical question remains: how do you make up for not having the slow, quiet time, the space that writing requires, in order to think about what's happening instead of having to contend with trying to produce an immediate reflection of the current moment? Again, to use translation as a metaphor, it's like the difference between simultaneous interpretation and literary translation. This question became, again, particularly driven home to me in the aftermath of yet another crisis, that of the Beirut port explosion on August 4, 2020, in which some incredible tonnage, no one is entirely sure how much, of ammonium nitrate, neglected and left to deteriorate at the Beirut port for 6 years, detonated at 6:08 p.m. on a summer's evening, resulting in one of the largest non-nuclear blasts in history. The cataclysm killed well over 200 people, devastated half of Beirut, leaving 300,000 people homeless, and shattered the entirety of its population. It also destroyed any last sense of normalcy or safety we had left after all the tumultuous months leading up to it, which included raging forest fires, as well as the aforementioned national uprising, ongoing economic collapse, and, oh yes, a global pandemic. It was incredibly alienating to see the way people's attention so quickly focused on Beirut's disaster, to the extent that even Twitter gave us a special little emoji to accompany the hashtag, the same way Me Too and BLM and other reality-shaking things have been reduced into hashtags. Alienating, too, to realize how quickly that attention waned. I was suddenly cast, quite reluctantly, into the role of journalist, simply by virtue of existing in a particular space and time. Different news outlets were reaching out relentlessly during that first month after the explosion, all of them asking for a personal perspective on what had happened, but also giving me barely enough space within which to reflect. I wrote all of these pieces from inside a neighborhood still smashed up, from inside a body still racked with terror, waking up every morning at 4 a.m. to the memory of the sound and the suddenness of the blast. I didn't know how to translate all of that reality-altering terror, and I was often tempted to want to exceptionalize Lebanese suffering. I mean, as I said, we'd already had a pretty awful year. At the same time, looking at the exploitative system of global capitalism in which we live, what I wanted most to say is that unfortunately, such an explosion is in fact not unimaginable. The system has neglect built into its very functioning. When the focus is on maximal profit and maintaining power for a strict few, then it's in fact fully in line with the system to ignore certain dangers when they don't seem to be worth the effort of fixing. We see this in the way the environment is neglected in favor of profit, or how certain entire classes of people are neglected as a matter of complete fact. So neglect is an integral part of the system, and, make no mistake, neglect in its most everyday form is already a kind of terrible violence exacted upon the psyche and the body, and which often results in death. It's a kind of death that is happening every day, all the time, to so many around us, but we don't notice it, except when it's taken to such an extreme that it makes its violence known in more legible ways. And to me, that's the example that Lebanon provides, the example it has always provided, which is what happens when this neglect, this exploitation, this lack of care, this complete disregard for human life in favor of power and profit looks like when it's turned up to its worst. I think of Lebanon as a petri dish, a microcosm of partisan neoliberalism's worst ills. And so, in fact, it's been useful for me to translate this disaster of August 4th into a more global language, to think about it not as an exception, but rather as a site of eruption within a larger system. These sites of eruption are, in fact, quite numerous and frequent. Two examples that immediately come to mind are the tragedy of London's Grenfell Tower 4 years ago now. 72 people lost their lives to a terrible fire that consumed their building with ferocious speed because those who constructed that building had used cladding known to be especially flammable and had done so because it was cheaper and because the sorts of people who lived in places like Grenfell Tower were the kind that, to the developers, didn't deserve the kind of attention or care they might provide for others. Working class people, mostly immigrants, people of color. Then, in May of this year, there was the train disaster in Mexico City, when a metro overpass collapsed because of shoddy construction, killing 26 people and injuring dozens more. Again, you have an example of extreme negligence resulting in catastrophe, all in favor of profit. I'm sure every one of you can think of at least 2 or 3 examples off the tops of your heads as well. And so feeling in Arabic has given me the stories that I want to tell. But thinking in English has forced me to be very deliberate about how to tell them. I work always to resist the disaster relief redemption arc that is often dictated by humanitarian language and organizations, where everything must end on a rising note, emphasizing notions of resilience and redemption, and where actual life must be made to bow to what I've always thought of as the tyranny of hope. This is another danger that comes from thinking too directly about one's audience. You realize, of course, that people's chief concern seems to be to see proof that their currency, whether in the form of money or attention, has been well spent. I call it a tyranny because this form of insistence on hope seems like a deliberate tactic to obscure the fact that, as I said earlier, disasters are not isolated incidents, but sites of eruption within a great system of endless war and economic inequality and colonialism and environmental destruction. And so when we avoid exceptionalizing disasters or suffering, it allows us to better see the relationships between all the different ruptures within this larger system. It's also a form of resistance to the system because it's one that has been designed to obscure connections between different events and histories and cultures, or what the writer Emil Alcalay calls in his book, A Little History, quote, the reciprocal relationship between cause and effect, unquote. That narrative imperative of hope maintains a space between cause and effect because it emphasizes the isolation of things rather than their continuity. And it does so in the supposed service of empathy and care. It demands the kind of extreme feeling from the reader, pity at the beginning of the story, transforming into a heroic admiration by the end, that only underscores otherness and thus widens the space between all of our experiences. And so how to preserve a history that acknowledges that relationship between cause and effect? According to Al-Khalai, quote, "It is crucial that we weigh and measure our efforts in light of our relationship to and reception of things that take place in other parts of the world. Otherwise, no matter how profound the personal impact of such acts of creation and preservation might be, they can revert to mere markers of identity and ownership. They cease to serve as proof of the refusal to let our histories and experiences be administered." Unquote. In other words, we must use our language deliberately to see beyond the spaces between us, of time, of history, of place, of circumstance. And this is where translation shines most brightly, not just as a metaphor for writing, but as a metaphor for how best to comport ourselves in the world, and instructional for how to navigate our relationship with the other. Because the first act of translation is to listen. Listen carefully, to think about the words, not just what is being said, but how. As translators, we lend our voices and our knowledge in order to louden and bolster the voices and knowledge of others. We naturally bring our own experiences to bear on someone else's, but must be careful of how much we allow them to intrude on that person's way of representing themselves, and remain aware of how such intrusion might be a form of silencing. We often make mistakes. We learn new things about the work every time we do it. We acknowledge from the outset that we will never achieve a perfect translation, but aim every time to create a faithful and perhaps even beautiful one. And in performing the act of translation, we somehow find our own pains coming to the surface, our own voices being allowed to speak, our own particularities added to someone else's, creating a single text that is the result of multiple interactions between the self and the other, between one language and the next, between writer and reader and translator, between the time in which the text was written and the present in which we are working on it. Within the translated text, none of these differences are contradictions or gaps or lacks or even forms of estrangement. They become the necessary parts of the same whole. No one has questions, right?
Comme on n'est pas beaucoup, on peut monter en haut. Et puis, si vous avez des questions, vous pouvez les poser directement à Lina, ce sera plus simple. Enfin, je vous invite volontiers à aller prendre un verre. Merci. Ah, tu voulais?
Oh.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk.
Oh,
it was very profound, and you touched upon so many important issues, both as a translator and as a writer. I was especially interested in your concept of sites of eruption. I think it's so helpful just to avoid the common traps of, talking about our countries or specific situations as unique rather than a condition that we share in very complex ways. But you were also talking about how important it is for you how these stories are written. And I've noticed that you have that tattoo in your wrist of a semicolon. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that, about the way in which you handle this, the minutiae of language and grammar. If you want to talk about the semicolon specifically, I would love to hear more about that. But the craft aspect of that structures your writing as such.
Thank you for that seemingly simple and yet incredibly difficult question. It's funny, actually, this idea of thinking and feeling. This is why I have these tattoos. It's my favorite punctuation mark, the semicolon. And the reason I love it so much is because it feels like the exact right space. It's like two ideas that are whole on their own and have to be complete sentences on their own, but are also too connected to put like a period between them. And this is exactly how I feel about somehow these two identities. So in fact, the semicolon on the right hand, which is the hand I write in, is in English, and the one on the left hand, which is the one connected to the heart, is in Arabic, because it's the same, but it's flipped out, like, because you're writing from, you know. Anyway, so this is a very good question, and I think my answer to that is constantly changing with every new thing that I'm working on. I'm always trying to like look at things and to see, for example, I think one of the kind of the, I mean, for the longest time when I would write stuff and I would try to convey, let's say, the sound or the music of Arabic, I did what a lot of people do, which is I would like in dialogue insert one or two words, you know, in the thing, and then continue in English. And then at one point I thought about it and I was like, that's absurd. Like, what are we meant to think the characters are speaking? Are they saying one word in Arabic and continuing the rest in English? Am I just giving this one word? You know, and it seemed like, so questioning these conventions for me felt like something really interesting. And then I remember when I read The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz, that kind of blew my mind, because the way that what he did was, he had entire sections of the text in Spanish with no translation. So basically, I mean, you could infer what was happening. You're reading the book in English, it didn't complete, like you could sort of work out what was being said. But it was also it was also like, he was clearly saying, my ideal reader is the bilingual one. And if you don't understand, you have to make the effort to try and figure it out, find a Spanish-speaking person, let them explain it to you, or just live with the incomplete knowledge of the text, right? And I thought this was so interesting, because it was like, it was someone who was not making excuses or apologizing for the fact that he was bilingual, or that, you know, and I think for me, I mean, I don't know if it's for various different reasons, but I think for me, it took me such a long time to like just give myself permission, like the permission of authorship to a certain extent. So this was like an example of how you could do it. Now, of course, you can't apply this to Arabic, because Arabic has to be transliterated, and there's a lot of sounds that don't exist in English. So I can't even give an idea of what it sounds like. But one of the things I do think about is dialogue and idiom. And this is a question, again, that comes back to translators, because there's different ways of translating a text. There's some schools of thought that say, you know, that you want to make the translation sound slightly foreign so that you're aware that you're reading a translated text. And other translators who feel like, no, you have to make it fluent, so that, in fact, so what happens is it's almost like incepting this other text into you through the fluency of the second language. And I find these very, very interesting questions. And so I sort of do a kind of a double thing. It's like when I'm writing the prose, I'm thinking about fluency. And when I'm writing dialogue, I'm thinking about like how to sort of translate certain idioms in a way that sort of jars you, so that you're aware that this is taking place. The novel, in fact, that I'm working on now is essentially kind of about this. Like, this question of translation keeps coming back into it. And there are constant reminders within the text that whatever is being relayed is happening, in fact, in a different language, you know? Yeah, but this is something I think about constantly, because, I mean, just to capture the music of a place is something that exists within a particular language, you know? And so, but I think for me, what has been kind of the biggest thing, and the thing that translation, like my work as a translator has really helped me reconcile, is, like I said at the end, not to think of these things as contradictions or spaces, but to think of them as places where you can actually, like, not just mend ruptures, but put a lie to the fact that they exist in the first place, you know? So I don't know if I hope that answers your question. Yeah? Thank you so much, everybody. Really, thank you. I very rudely